Afghanistan is witnessing violence like never before. The Taliban is making bold territorial gains, compromising the Afghans' faith in their government. Recently, the terror group admitted to the cold-blooded murder of Afghanistan's most popular comedian. All peace negotiations have failed to achieve any goal. The US pullout of troops is near complete. Welcome to WION World Isman. My name is Priyanka Sharma, and this is our special weekly broadcast of the WION-VOA Co-Production, where we'll see what impact the situation in Afghanistan is having on its people. Let's begin. The latest round of peace talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government in Qatar ended on July 19th with no apparent progress. The group's past refusal to accept women's freedoms has many Afghans worried about their future. Voice of America's Mahdi Mehreen has this next report. Take a look.
Since the Taliban fell from power in Afghanistan in 2001, the passage of modern civil law has allowed Afghan women to improve their lives, both socially and politically. They can work, study, vote, get elected to parliament, and perform in the highest political and managerial positions. The Afghan cabinet has seen several female ministers over the past 20 years.
Afghanistan's new generation is no longer a generation that can accept the Taliban's extremist ideology. We hope the situation that arises will be something acceptable for Afghan society, especially women.
But the reality is that US troops will leave in September. Peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban are stalled, and women have been underrepresented during the past talks. In late June, Taliban officials put out a statement promising that in post-conflict Afghanistan, women would be able to seek work and education. But in areas of Afghanistan retaken by the Taliban, there are reports of restrictions being imposed on women, and that's worrying to many Afghans.
Our fear is that the Taliban will come back with the same ideology as before, with the same savagery and barbarism of their previous years. We hope the outcome of the peace talks will be something that does not impose restrictions on people, especially women and children.
The Taliban rules of Afghanistan from 1995 to 2001 and enforcement of fundamentalist Islamic law marked a dark period for Afghan women. They were not allowed to leave home, work, or study, and were forced to wear the full hijab or burqa on the street during the travel and even in emergencies. Women had virtually no right to determine their own political and social destiny and were severely isolated. The oppression of women was unprecedented in Afghan history.
The biggest concern of women and girls is having the right to choose in all areas of life, from stepping out of the home to meet their simplest needs, to choosing a spouse and choosing to study, work, and more. Women are worried that if the Taliban come back, they will be imprisoned at home and will no longer have the right to be in the sun. The Taliban view women as a man views his belongings and material things. Even worse, a man protects his belongings, but the Taliban do not do that for women. Their views leave no room for hope for Afghan women.
Even if the Afghan peace talks results in a deal, Afghan women rights activists worry the Taliban will try to use their renewed influence to limit women's freedoms. Mahdi Mehreen for VOA News, Washington.
For more updates about the ongoing situation in Afghanistan, joining me now on this special broadcast is Voice of America's Amy Hybels from Washington, D.C. Amy, thanks so much for joining us. My first question to you. A UN report issued on Monday indicates that civilian casualties in Afghanistan have hit record highs. How concerning is the timing of all this? Right, we have some technical difficulties in reaching Amy as of now. We'll get her patched in as soon as we can. For now, the story that we're tracking is that the latest round of peace talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government in Qatar ended on July 19 with no apparent progress. Violence continues unabated in Afghanistan, with the Taliban recently killing a popular comedian in the country. The group's past refusal to accept women's freedoms has many Afghans worried about their future. Now, since the Taliban's fall from power in Afghanistan in the year 2001, the passage of the modern civil law has allowed the Afghan women to improve their lives, both socially and politically. They can work, study, vote, get elected to parliament and perform in the highest political and managerial positions. The Afghan cabinet has seen several female ministers over the past 20 years. However, what will happen now to the women's freedoms is the biggest concern for the Human Rights Watch as well as other human rights activists in the region, especially in the light of the fact that peace talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban are stalled. Women have for long been underrepresented during the past peace talks or any kind of negotiations between the Taliban and the Afghan government. In fact, in late June, the Taliban officials had put out a statement promising that after the conflict in Afghanistan, women would be able to seek work and education opportunities. But then again, in areas of Afghanistan which have now been retaken by the Taliban, there are reports of restrictions that have been imposed on women, and that's what's worrying to many Afghans in the country. Now, for more insights about the ongoing developments in the country, joining me now is Amy Hybels from Voice of America. Now, my first question to you, Amy, a UN report issued on Monday indicates that civilian casualties in Afghanistan have hit record highs. How concerning is the timing of all this?
Well, yes, the timing is obviously very concerning as the increase in civilian casualties in this new report coincides with the drawdown of U.S. and NATO troops that was first announced back in April and then actually got underway back in May. Now, this new report by the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan says that the total number of civilians killed and injured between January and June of this year has increased by 47% over the same time period last year. Of particular concern, there's a record number of girls and women that have been killed and injured, according to the UN. They say that the Taliban is responsible for 39% of civilian casualties and that the Afghan National Security Forces are responsible for 23% of civilian casualties. Now, the Taliban have outright rejected the UN findings, and the Afghan government says its forces are not responsible for causing civilian casualties. At this point, UN officials are appealing to all the warring parties on the ground in Afghanistan to come to some sort of peace agreement. The unfortunate thing in all of this, in addition to the casualties that have been reported, is the increased fighting has forced a lot of families to flee their homes, adding to the already large number of families who are displaced within their own country.
Right, Amy, thank you for those statistics. Now, what is the U.S. doing to assist the Afghan forces during this drawdown?
Well, sure. During the drawdown, two important areas that the U.S. is assisting the Afghans in includes the U.S. military has recently increased airstrikes in support of the Afghan security forces as the Taliban continue to gain ground in Afghanistan. U.S. General Frank McKenzie, who heads the U.S. Central Command, was actually in Kabul on Sunday. He said that the U.S. is prepared to continue this level of heightened support in the coming weeks if the Taliban continues its attacks in that country. Now, while remarking that the government of Afghanistan faces a stern test in the days ahead, the general said there is no preordained conclusion to this fight. Another area that the U.S. is providing assistance to, you've probably already heard about, the first flight of Afghan applicants for the Special Immigrant Visa Program and their families landed in the U.S. today. They arrived on a commercial flight at Dulles International Airport here in Virginia. It's just outside of Washington, D.C. More than 200 Afghans are on that flight, and the administration hopes to relocate about 700 applicants and all of their immediate family members in this first group. Of course, there's a lot of questions that remain about the fate of those other Afghans who worked with the U.S. military during the war who remain in country, as a lot of them are not very far along in the application process. So that's a story we'll continue to follow closely here in the U.S.
All right, Amy, thank you so much for all those inputs. I request you to stay with us on this special broadcast. We'd like you to weigh in on another story. Now, the number of known COVID deaths has now crossed 4 million. According to the Johns Hopkins University, which is tracking both cases and deaths, in the past 100 years, there have been flu and cholera epidemics and the AIDS epidemics, of course, and multiple other diseases around the globe. Voice of America's Carol Pearson says the latest research shows that many epidemics either don't have to happen or can be contained and avoided. Take a look.
As some countries prepare for yet another wave of the coronavirus, doctors in countries with a surplus of vaccines are begging people to get vaccinated.
I'm Dr. Michael Bolding. I've been working our COVID unit for the last 16 months. I get asked on a daily basis now what our COVID unit looks like.
Bolding says he is now seeing very sick, unvaccinated patients in their 20s and 30s.
With no comorbid conditions, ending up on ventilators, BiPAP, high-flow oxygen, and extremely sick, sicker than at any time during this pandemic.
With a vaccine, severe illness and death from COVID-19 can be avoided.
We're calling for a global goal of 717, 7 days to detect an outbreak, 1 day to notify an outbreak, and 7 days to mount an effective response.
VOA interviewed Amanda McClelland at a summit on disease prevention and control. She says it's possible to prevent epidemics and cites Uganda as an example. Uganda stopped a recent Ebola outbreak at its border with the Democratic Republic of Congo.
Uganda responded to the risk and mobilized their communities, mobilized their health systems to strengthen surveillance along the border, and was able to detect Ebola cases and care for those patients effectively, and they didn't have an Ebola outbreak.
In fact, a study released in April by Resolve to Save Lives that's called Epidemics That Didn't Happen included multiple examples of situations where countries avoided or stopped epidemics. Here's another example. In 2014, Nigeria stopped an Ebola outbreak, and in 2016, Brazil prevented a yellow fever epidemic from taking hold. In both cases, health officials implemented coordinated response activities, effective communication, and dedicated leadership. McClellan says the key is good leadership and building trust at the community level.
You can't just come when something bad happens. You have to be there all of the time. You have to meet the communities where they are and address their everyday health needs, and that builds trust.
McClelland says trust, good journalism, and a strong civil society help communities push back against disinformation and politicizing diseases, vaccines, and treatments. Carol Pearson, VOA News.
For a better understanding of this news development, we still have Voice of America's Washington correspondent Amy Hybels with us on WION. Amy, what can you tell us about the newest guidance issued on Tuesday from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention due to the prevalence of the more contagious Delta variant?
Well, U.S. health officials say that the highly transmissible Delta variant is what's behind this new mask guidance that was just put out by the CDC this week. They say that fully vaccinated individuals should go back to wearing masks if they're in areas where there's a high transmission rate, which is happening right now in large parts of the country. Now, while the number of new infections are driven by the unvaccinated, the director for the CDC says that the new data indicates that in these rare breakthrough cases where a fully vaccinated person contracts COVID, the amount of virus that they're carrying in their nasal passages and in their throat is the same. It's just as high as the viral load that unvaccinated people have. They didn't know that before. Now, the Washington Post is reporting on information obtained from an internal CDC document that says the Delta variant appears to cause more severe illness than the earlier variants and spreads as easily as the chicken pox, which is definitely not good news. Now, here in the nation's capital, our transmission rate is increasing, so our mayor has required all of us to mask up again in indoor venues beginning on Saturday. Yesterday, President Joe Biden announced that all federal employees will be required to be vaccinated before returning to work, or they'll have to undergo regular testing to make sure that they don't have the coronavirus. And this week, Google and Facebook said that U.S. employees will be required to be vaccinated before returning to the workplace. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens in the private sector. You know, we have thousands of small businesses across this country, to see what kind of direction they'll take when it comes to requiring their employees to vaccinate before they head back to the offices this fall.
Right, Amy, that's actually a very important point, since you mentioned the private sector in the U.S. Despite the pandemic, what can you tell us about a growing number of U.S. employees who have decided to either quit their jobs or work from home permanently, especially in the light of rising cases?
Yeah, that's an interesting issue. VOA actually decided to do a story on this after learning that nearly 4 million people in the American workforce chose to quit their jobs in April. That's according to the U.S. Labor Department. That's the largest single-month quit rate in the last 20 years, so it's significant. Now, some workers that VOA spoke with said that they wanted to continue to work remotely. You know, they weren't happy with the idea of having to go back into an office setting, or they left because of burnout after working through very difficult situations throughout the coronavirus pandemic. Others may be considering life priorities and taking a new look at things. How do they want to spend their time? Do they really want to have that 45-minute commute to and from work every day? And companies obviously are scrambling to react. Apple, for example, is offering its employees a hybrid return to the office. And over the decade, the number of rates and resignations in this country have slowly been climbing. It's interesting, those did level out during the pandemic, but a business expert from Texas A&M University says that's probably because there was a backlog of individuals that were just kind of hanging on to their jobs during the coronavirus pandemic who would have otherwise resigned from their jobs. You know, it's going to be interesting to see how this work culture plays out, especially in light of the new information we have on the Delta variant, and as you know, employers grapple with what does this look like as their employees prepare to return to the office or work from home this fall. A lot of unanswered questions at this point as the labor force tries to move forward.
Right, Amy, definitely. This is going to be a lot of tumultuous questions for all those joining the workforce again in the U.S. and elsewhere as well. Thank you for all your inputs on this special broadcast, and thank you for joining us.